into a hardware store and look at the end of a cut lumber beam, you don't need a degree in botany to know what you're looking at. You see the grain. You see the hexagonal cellular clustering. You see the sheer flat plane where the blades severed the structure. Your brain instantly recognizes the geometry of a harvested organism. But when you stand at the base of Devil's Tower in Wyoming and you look up at vertical hexagonal columns of identical biological precision, sheer cut at the top across an area the size of a football field, you do not see a severed organism, because you have been trained since childhood to call it a geological anomaly. I look at cellular structures for a living, plant pathology. I spend hours in a quiet lab staring through a microscope at the vascular tissue of diseased crops. It is slow, predictable work. Last November, I was looking at a cross-section of a dried flax stem, a standard slide. I had drone footage of the Giant's Causeway playing silently on my secondary monitor just for background movement. I glanced from the monitor to the eyepiece, then back to the monitor. I sat there for a long time. The heating vent above my desk was rattling. It does that when the temperature drops below freezing. Under the microscope, the flax stem is made of tightly packed, perfectly hexagonal tubes, phloem and xylem, bundled together to draw moisture up from the dirt. On the monitor, the Giant's Causeway in Ireland was made of tightly packed, perfectly hexagonal columns of basalt.
The shapes were identical, not similar, identical. The official explanation for columnar basalt is thermal contraction, magma pooling, cooling rapidly, and cracking into perfect hexagons. I pulled up the geology papers right there at my desk. They use phrases like tensional stress and isotropy. It reads like an apology, like a discipline trying very hard to explain why the Earth randomly decided to perfectly mimic the internal cellular structure of a vascular plant at a scale millions of times larger than any known biology. I didn't want to arrive here, but the logic brought me. I went to the petrified forest in Arizona a few years ago. You can walk right up to pieces of wood from the Triassic period that are completely solid stone, heavy, cold, ringing like glass if you knock on them with a knuckle. The park rangers explain the chemistry perfectly. A tree falls in a swamp, it gets buried in volcanic ash. Over thousands of years, groundwater carrying dissolved silica seeps into the wood. The minerals crystallize cell by cell, completely replacing the organic material with quartz. It is an accepted scientific fact. Carbon-based biology can be entirely replaced by silicon-based minerals, preserving the exact shape of the original organism in solid rock. I keep coming back to this, and I'm not entirely sure why I didn't see the scale problem sooner. If a normal carbon-based tree can turn into a silicon rock, preserving its bark and rings, what happens to a biological entity that is already made of silicon? That might sound like a reach. Keep it in mind.
We know there are organisms on Earth right now that use silicon for their structural support. Diatoms, sea sponges, microscopic things that build glass architectures for themselves. We just assume the limit of that biology is microscopic. But look at the American Southwest. Look at Monument Valley. You drive out there and the air is so dry it cracks the inside of your nose. You look at these massive, sheer-sided pillars of rock rising straight up out of the flat desert floor, mesas, buttes. The geologists say this is the result of millions of years of wind and water eroding a massive plateau, leaving only the hardest rock behind. I bought a topographic map of the region. I laid it out on my dining table. Wind erosion is chaotic. Water erosion is fluid. They don't shear the tops of mountains off in perfectly flat, horizontal plains spanning miles. They don't leave vertical striations that look exactly like petrified bark. Look at Mount Roraima in Venezuela.
a plateau jutting out of the Amazon, surrounded by vertical cliffs thousands of feet high. The top is completely flat, and the ecosystem on that flat surface contains plant and animal species that exist nowhere else on Earth. Biologists call it an evolutionary island. It is an island because it is the severed, flat surface of a stump. I started measuring the bases of these formations on the map, the circumferences, and then I applied a standard botanical formula, the ratio of a tree trunk's girth to its canopy height. If Devil's Tower is a stump, the tree it belonged to was 2.5 miles high.
I had to walk away from the table. I went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water just to have something to do with my hands. My palms were sweating. 2.5 miles. A biological structure that size changes the atmospheric pressure around it. It changes the local gravity. It requires a root system that would penetrate the Earth's crust so deeply it would reach the mantle. And then I started thinking about caves. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, Son Dong in Vietnam, massive, branching, fractal voids in the Earth. The limestone erosion theory explains some of it, but not the scale, not the way the tunnels taper and branch, exactly like the necrotic hollows of a dead root system rotting away over millennia. We hike through these massive underground chambers, shining our headlamps on the damp walls, thinking we are exploring geological fissures. We are crawling through the empty space left behind when the roots of a 2-mile-high silicon organism dissolved into the soil. We are walking in the footprints of giants, not giant men, giant biology. And we are living in a cleared forest.
But asking how a tree could grow 2 miles high is the wrong question. It assumes the tree was just a plant. It assumes it was doing what the carbon-based scrub brush in our modern forests does. It wasn't. Silicon is the foundation of modern computing. It is a semiconductor. A silicon-based biological organism of that scale, reaching miles into the upper atmosphere, isn't a tree. It is a conductive tower. It is an atmospheric antenna. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. The official history of the 19th century is obsessed with the discovery of electricity. The great men, Faraday, Edison, Tesla, the Romantic era of taming lightning. But the physical evidence suggests electricity wasn't discovered. It was what remained after the planet's primary energy grid was cut down. It would explain the global uniformity of these massive flat-topped structures on every continent. If you wanted to harvest a planetary energy network, you wouldn't just cut down one tower, you'd sever the entire canopy. It would explain the immediate desperate push in the mid-1800s to extract coal, oil, and gas from the Earth, a frantic scramble to replace an energy source that had just been destroyed, a source that didn't require digging or burning, but simply tapping into the standing wave of the atmosphere through massive living silicon conduits. It would explain the sudden coordinated effort to map the Earth's geology in the 19th century, to categorize every mesa, every basalt column, every plateau under a new, rigid scientific framework. I started looking into the early geologists, the founders of the discipline. Charles Lyell in the 1830s. He popularized uniformitarianism, the idea that the Earth was shaped only by slow, gradual processes over millions of years. Erosion, tectonic drift. The explicit goal, stated in his own letters, was to free the science from Moses, to rid geology of any theory that involved sudden, cataclysmic changes to the Earth's surface. It is a very convenient theory if you need to explain away the corpses of a harvested world.
If you teach generations of scientists that a sheer, perfectly flat mountaintop is the result of millions of years of wind, and that a perfect hexagonal column is the result of cooling lava, eventually they stop seeing the geometry of a harvested organism. They just see geology. We are trained to call it geology. I went to the library archives at the university where I work. I wanted to see the early surveys of the American West, the reports sent back by men like John Wesley Powell in the 1870s. I was looking for the language they used before the terminology was locked down. The reading room was empty. The air conditioning was humming that low, steady frequency that you only notice when the room is silent. I had a box of Powell's unedited field notes. He described the Grand Canyon, but he didn't describe it the way a modern geologist does. He kept using the word excavation. He talked about the terraced walls, the stepped layers of rock descending for miles into the earth, the sheer, impossible scale of the missing material. I pulled up a satellite image of the Bingham Canyon mine in Utah on my phone. It's the largest man-made excavation on Earth, an open-pit copper mine. It is a massive hole in the ground, defined by precise, descending terraced steps cut into the rock by heavy machinery. I laid my phone next to a high-resolution photograph of the Grand Canyon. The terracing is identical. The sweeping circular cuts into the earth, the stepped layers, the sheer volume of missing material. The Grand Canyon isn't a riverbed that slowly eroded over 6 million years. A river cuts a V-shape. It doesn't cut mathematically precise horizontal terraces 10 miles wide. The Grand Canyon is a strip mine. It is the physical scar of a harvest so massive we cannot comprehend the machinery required to execute it. We stand on the edge of the rim, look down at the terraced walls, and take pictures of the sunset hitting the rock. We think it's beautiful. We think it's natural. We are looking at the damage. I sat in the archive room for 3 hours, staring at those two images. The hum of the air conditioning felt louder. My neck was stiff. I realized I was holding my breath. If the trees were the energy grid and the canyons are the strip mines where the root systems were harvested, then who or what was doing the harvesting? I don't know. The records don't exist. There is no invoice for the destruction of the Earth's canopy, but there is a specific kind of silence in the geological record. I looked for the chemical analysis of the rock at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the Vishnu schist, the oldest rock in the formation. The geologists say it was formed under extreme heat and pressure, but the early assays, the ones from the late 1800s, before the terminology was sanitized, note incredibly high concentrations of conductive minerals, quartz, mica, iron, the exact components you would expect to find at the base of a massive silicon-based semiconductor. And then those early assays stop appearing in the citations. They aren't refuted, they are just omitted. A structural incuriosity takes over. The modern papers cite the modern papers, and the foundational data, the data that suggests the rock is the conductive root of a severed antenna, is quietly filed away in the basement. The silence is the proof, the absolute, coordinated refusal to ask why the Earth is covered in perfectly flat stumps and mathematically terraced pits. We are living in a cleared forest. I don't go hiking anymore. My colleagues ask me why, especially when the weather turns warm. I tell them my knees are acting up from too much time on the lab stool. It is a simple lie. It is much easier than trying to explain what it feels like to stand inside a crime scene and pretend it is a garden. Last weekend, I drove out toward the Cascades. I didn't plan to stop.
I just needed to get out of the city, out of the lab. The highway cuts right through the rock in places. You can see the sheer faces where the blasting crews made room for the asphalt. I pulled over at a scenic overlook. The air smelt like hot engine oil and damp pine needles. I leaned against the hood of my car and looked out over the valley, at the ridges, at the flat-topped plateaus sitting quietly in the distance under the heavy cloud cover.
We build our national parks around the corpses of the old world. We put up brass plaques or the observation decks, offering clean, sanitized paragraphs about wind and water. We draw little diagrams of tectonic plates for the tourists. We do this to comfort ourselves. We are fiercely protecting the weeds that grew in the cracks of a slaughtered world. We look at the tiny, fragile, carbon-based bushes growing in the dust of the Silicon era, catching fire every summer, rotting away every winter, and we call it a forest. We are trained to call it geology. We are trained to look at the devastation and see majesty. The harvesting never actually stopped. It simply changed scale. We are still digging up the fragmented root systems. We mine the quartz, the lithium, the copper. We drag the residual conductive material out of the dirt, melt it down, and string it up on dead wooden poles. We built a crude, fragile, metered grid to replace a planetary resonance we can't even remember. And we pay a utility company every month for the privilege of using the scraps. I went to the hardware store yesterday morning. I needed to fix a broken shelf in the lab. I stood in the lumber aisle. The smell of sawdust and industrial adhesive was thick in the air. The fluorescent lights were humming above the concrete floor. I pulled a standard 2x4 off the rack. I ran my thumb over the rough wood. I looked at the end of the beam, the grain, the cellular clustering, the sheer flat cut of the saw blade, the geometry of a harvested organism. I held the wood in my hands and walked out the automatic doors, out into the parking lot. I looked past the strip mall, past the power lines toward the horizon. The flat, sheared top of the mountain line was standing against the gray sky, waiting silently in the fog. The blade has already passed through. We are living in a cleared forest, and we have agreed, quietly, to call it nature.